But to the polls. Politicians should be not slave to the polls, but nor should they be blind. Today's news poll showed the Turnbull government slumping even further behind Labor, down to 46% after preferences to Labor's 54%. That's 11 months now that the government has been behind Labor, and a long way behind. I doubt there's a Liberal MP left who thinks the government can win the next election under this Prime Minister. The time for denial is over, and calls for the government to just communicate its successes better are just whistling in the wind.
They're not good, and I think they highlight the fact that, you know, we need to get our message through a lot more effectively than we have been. The problems that we're confronting and the challenge that we face, getting our message through, are a challenge for every member of the coalition.
Here's the problem for Mr Laundy and the other ministers. What successes does the government have to boast about, to weave into this better message that's supposed to convince everyone? What are its big successes? Instead, it's so far given us record debt, record spending, record tax take, and last week showed wages growth at record low levels, at or below inflation. And that means, of course, that living standards have in fact not risen for 3 years now. No wonder voters are cranky. Joining me for One Nation, filling in for Peter Credlin, is Sky News' own Samantha Maiden. Sam, it's great to see you. Sam, first the polls. What has got the government to this terrible point where it's had 11 months now of not just being behind Labor, but almost all of it a long way behind?
Well, if you look at where Malcolm Turnbull's approval ratings and where the polls really took a big slide, it really was not that long after he became Prime Minister when he squibbed it on major reform, on essentially this flirtation that they had with Big Bang tax reform and doing something in relation to the GST. And I think that that is kind of when the balloon deflated, if you like. I think people were very optimistic about Malcolm Turnbull. I think people thought that he was going to take the government by the scruff of its neck and sort of shake it and get things done. But then he seemed to be quite timid, and that's where the polling really sort of collapsed, and it has never really recovered. And I think that the danger for the government is that voters have made up their minds, and you see this a lot with polling. Yes, polling can turn around, but when the polling is this consistent, it really is telling you a message that voters are pretty comfortable with the idea, at this stage at least, of electing Bill Shorten Prime Minister at the next election.
I think you're right. The government MPs I was talking to today, and some of whom I heard from today, seem to accept that the government's in mortal strife, but no one seems to have any idea or will to change direction. There's almost like a fatalism, you know, they just walk off the cliff. I don't know. How are you reading it?
I think fatalism is a very correct assessment of how a lot of MPs feel. The lessons of recent history seems to be that just changing leaders is not necessarily the answer. And of course, in the case of whether you would turn to Tony Abbott or Peter Dutton I think is seen very clearly as the next leader of the Liberal Party, but he doesn't show up in polling as someone who would necessarily lift the vote beyond where it is under Malcolm Turnbull. I think he's seen as a next generation leader who may not be ready just yet. Now, the other option is, of course, is the option that's described to me in the past as the off-the-shelf option, is you could obviously grab Tony Abbott off the shelf. He would be ready to go. He's experienced as a campaigner. However, he would be, first of all, very divisive. I think there'd be a lot of frontbenchers that probably wouldn't be able to countenance having him as the leader again, given the way that he has behaved after he was turfed from the job. And there's no evidence in the polling that he would necessarily be able to lift the results. In fact, there's been some evidence to the contrary. So he would probably help secure the base, and there has certainly been arguments that he's a very good campaigner campaigner, but he's not like, it's not a situation as you had, for example, with Kevin Rudd, where Kevin Rudd was utterly despised by the Labor Party, but quite popular with voters, and there would always be polls that suggested that Labor's vote would lift if they put him back in and that he would at least be able to save the furniture. And there's a strong argument that Labor putting back Kevin Rudd, even though they had to put a peg on their nose to do it, did actually help them protect seats and did actually put them in a far more competitive space going into the last election.
No, I agree with you completely. And, of course, the deal he made with Papua New Guinea to send boat people to Nauru gave the Labor some sort of something to hang their hat on, that boat people catastrophe. They actually had some solution, so there was that. But I agree with you on his popularity. Tony Abbott does not have Kevin Rudd's popularity. I think he's probably got the strategic smarts. But I think your point is right, because there's another element to the danger of switching to Abbott, and that is the High Court could soon rule the Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce was unlawfully elected, having been a New Zealand citizen. Now, he should win a by-election in his seat, but if he doesn't, the government will rely on the backing of one of the 5 crossbenchers to stay in power, which means support from either Andrew Wilkie, the Greens' Adam Bandt, Rebecca Sharkey of Nick Xenophon's team, Bob Katter, or Cathy McGowan. And that support has actually been weakening lately, hasn't it? I wonder how much of it would actually stick with if they turn to Abbott.
Well, I think that the truth is that we are still some way off that. Certainly if you went to that hypothetical situation of having a by-election, not only having a by-election, but Barnaby Joyce losing that by-election, which I think is a pretty big hypothetical, the reality is you would still need 76 seats, an absolute 76 votes, an absolute majority on the floor of Parliament to essentially pass a motion of no confidence in the government. So certainly you would have a situation where, you know, you could get to 75, you could have a hung parliament, you could have all those things arise as they did under the Julia Gillard years, where they could try and lure, you know, a renegade MP to be Speaker and so on and so forth. It would be wonkier, but at this stage at least, Rebecca Sharkey and Cathy McGowan have said that they are going to continue to offer supply and confidence. So they're never going to vote on every bill with the government, but they're not going to vote in a motion of no confidence, and that is the only way you could essentially see the government change hands on the floor of Parliament. If that were to happen, you know, clearly, no doubt, the first thing they'd do is someone would go to the Governor-General to call a general election. But I think that it does make it wobblier that we had Bob Katter come out on Sky News last week and say that, you know, he's no longer guaranteeing supply and confidence. Malcolm Turnbull made a lot of that when he offered that guarantee previously, saying that he had Bob Katter in his back pocket. He doesn't have that anymore.
No, but the point is, Sharkey and McGowan are more left-leaning. Would they stick with the Liberal government if they switched to Tony Abbott? And just to add a little spice to that, what if Turnbull is replaced? Maybe he would quit Parliament, and that would cause a by-election in his seat as well. And now that is perhaps more likely or harder for the government to actually win. Then it really would be down to how many crossbenchers would stick with Tony Abbott to keep the government in power. And it just adds to the whole dilemma of uncertainty. What do the Liberals do now? It's going to be really hard to sack Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, it certainly is, and I think that perception of chaos and instability is something that a lot of Liberal MPs are saying is feeding into these poor poll results. The chaos over the citizenship, the chaos and the division over the same-sex marriage postal vote. All of these things make it look like the government is navel-gazing rather than talking about what people care about, their power bills, their wages, taxes, all of these issues. They're not talking about bread and butter issues. Citizenship, I think the most dangerous thing for the government in the last fortnight is that they have been reduced to a laughingstock. Now,
Yes.
when people are actually openly laughing at the government, that is a very, very bad place to be. And I think you saw it on the floor of Parliament as well with Julie Bishop. She was trying to run this argument, which I think was very spurious, that Labor was somehow engaged in some sort of international subterfuge by simply, you know, checking on citizenship. Now, I think this was a very, very silly argument for 2 reasons. One is it's laughable. The Liberal Party would do the same thing in the same position. But more to the point, this is our constitution. This is the law. Are they suggesting that the Labor Party, you know, should engage in some sort of international conspiracy to suppress the facts. The reality is, if Barnaby Joyce is a dual citizen, he's not eligible to sit in Parliament. He can argue his case in the High Court in terms of reasonable steps or not knowing, but none of the others knew either. And why should the Labor Party suppress that information? Why should they not ask, questions about whether someone should be able to legally sit in Parliament?
That we have to say this. I mean, it's just a joke. What is the Brains Trust doing? But on that citizenship thing, right, Nick Xenophon now says, oh, whoops, I was a British citizen through my Cypriot father. So that adds the uncertainty. And now the Liberals are trying to say, hey, listen, Bill Shorten, there's a question mark that he could be British through his dad. Today he was brushing aside that suggestion, although refusing to hand over any documents. Let's have a listen to him.
The government is desperately trying to peddle its newest conspiracy that I'm a secret English agent. The reality is no, I'm not. I renounced my citizenship in 2006, and there's no whiff of evidence of anything to the contrary.
Why wouldn't he release his documents, Sam?
I think that's a good question. I think he should. I don't think there's any excuse for that. To be fair, Tony Abbott declined to reveal his own citizenship documents for many, many, many years. He only quite recently provided the information of when he'd renounced his own citizenship. Maybe they think that there's sort of beneath them or something that they're being prime ministerial. They should cough up the documents. I mean, I'd be surprised if there was a problem, because the Labor Party, particularly the Victorian Labor Party, is really, really, really big on these citizenship tests. They've been driving all their MPs completely around the twist for this for the last decade, and all of these MPs complaining that the processes were very onerous, and they're not complaining anymore. But I do think that Bill Shorten should provide that documentation.
I agree, but I suspect he's just wanting the topic and the controversy to keep going. Eventually he will prove it, but meanwhile it just keeps going on and on. I suspect that's what it's about. We desperately need an audit to get to the bottom of this, but I don't think Labor will agree to it. Just finally, one really interesting thing in the poll. It wasn't a big lift, but One Nation did lift in News poll back to 9%. It's been higher than that, of course, 10%. But it suggests to me that the political class and some of the Liberal ministers who damned her burqa stunt last week don't get what appeals to her public.
Well, look, two things about that. One is I doubt that that burqa appearance would have done her any harm in terms of her base. I'd probably be a little bit cautious about over-interpreting that lift. It's a 1% lift. That is completely within the margin error, and the margin of error there, you're talking about a very small sample size. So I wouldn't read too much into it, other than to say it certainly doesn't appear to have hurt her.
No, I think more might be revealed tomorrow with the Essential Media poll. Sam Maiden, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Coming up, the government